Hello, Bio30. This endocrine lesson is going to be on the thyroid gland and glands responsible for the regulation of calcium in your body. For starters, with the thyroid gland, this is a gland that's located in your neck area. It's located just in front of your trachea or your windpipe and just down below the larynx, which is your voice box. Primary function of the thyroid gland is to regulate your body's metabolic rate. And what that has to do with is how quickly your body is using its energy. So it speeds up the rate at which the cells are using that energy, breaking it down and using the fuel. And this also has an influence on what is called your basal metabolic rate, the rate at which you are burning the energy when you are at rest. And it is also responsible for normal growth and normal development. And we'll see as well that there is one element as well, iodine, which is essential for the proper functioning of the thyroid gland. And if you do have a deficiency in iodine, we'll see that it can create some problems with the formation of the thyroid hormones. This picture here is showing the glands that are involved and at least the abbreviations for the hormones that are involved with the thyroid gland and the eventual production of what we call the thyroid hormones. So you can think of these glands as being gland A, in the brain, the hypothalamus, neurosecretory cells that are producing and releasing a releasing hormone, abbreviated here RH. And this one produced by the hypothalamus, it is thyroid stimulating hormone, releasing hormone. Sometimes you will also just simply see this as thyroid releasing hormone or TRH. But it is a releasing hormone and its function is really to just target the anterior pituitary, which would be our gland B. Gland B, in this case, is going to be producing a second hormone. That second hormone is thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. It is this thyroid stimulating hormone that can then circulate throughout the body as it does enter the blood, but its only target is really the thyroid gland. When it does find its target tissue, the gland C, the thyroid gland, is then going to lead to the production of a third hormone or a combination of hormones that we usually just refer to as the thyroid hormones. So for these three different glands, we then have three different hormones. Hormone number one is the thyroid stimulating hormone releasing hormone. Hormone number two, the thyroid stimulating hormone, which in turn stimulates the thyroid to produce the thyroid hormones. These thyroid hormones, then we can see here, they will then target a number of different tissues throughout your body. In fact, many of the cells and tissues, organs in your body are affected by thyroid hormones. So this picture here, again, we just see the location of these different glands in your body, starting with the hypothalamus at the top. And you'll see here that it doesn't have TSHRH, but simply TRH for thyrotropin releasing or releasing hormone. It's telling the thyroid or the anterior pituitary gland that we see here to produce the thyroid stimulating hormone, which is telling the thyroid gland to produce and release the thyroid hormones. And again, a bunch of the effects that we see here. It also shows, and we'll come back to this, it shows the negative feedback. So once we do have the final hormone that is produced here in the chain, which is the thyroid hormone, you do need to regulate the production of that hormone to make sure that when you're maintaining homeostasis, you have the ideal amount of that hormone, not too little and not too much of that hormone either. So if we go back to the previous picture here, what we can add in is that negative feedback. So from our final hormone, the thyroid hormone, here we're going to see a feedback. There will be some receptors on the anterior pituitary that will respond to thyroid hormone. There will also be some receptors on the hypothalamus that will respond to the thyroid hormones. And in both cases, the response is going to be a negative feedback. So what that means is the thyroid hormones. When they attach to the hypothalamic cells, they're going to say decrease this production of thyroid stimulating hormone releasing hormone, and they'll tell the anterior pituitary to decrease the production of thyroid stimulating hormone. If there's already enough thyroid hormones circulating around, you don't need any more to be produced, and that's the idea behind this negative feedback. So these are some of the problems with inadequate production of thyroid hormones or too much thyroid hormone being produced. A couple of prefixes here that you should be familiar with. First one is hyper, and this prefix hyper, whatever we're talking about, it means that something is higher than what it typically should be. The other prefix, hypo, is exactly the opposite. So hypo is going to be lower than what it should be. The term hyperthyroidism then means that there is too much of the thyroid hormone being produced, too much of the thyroid hormone being circulated through the blood, and an over-response in some of the target tissues. So some of the effects that are associated with this, remember that a function of the thyroid hormone is to regulate metabolism. So if you have too much of the thyroid hormones, you'll have an increased metabolic rate. You're burning more fuel, and if you are burning more fuel, there's always going to be some heat that is being released due to the inefficiency of energy transformations like cellular respiration. So this does result in an increase in body temperature. People that do have hyperthyroidism are typically warmer. They feel warmer than people that do not have hyperthyroidism. What goes along with this is they are trying to cool their body off, so increased sweating. They're burning a lot of the fuel, and that includes the fat reserves, so we will see a fat reduction. Even though they're burning off this fuel, they do have an increased appetite. They need to replace that fuel, so their appetite is increasing, but they can't seem to eat enough to compensate for the increased metabolic rate, so they do see a weight loss. A couple of other ones, increased heart rate, and these people are typically more active, hyperactive compared to the general population, always wanting to be on the go. The opposite, the hypothyroidism, really exactly the opposite in terms of the symptoms that we see here. So instead of an increased metabolic rate, it's going to be a decreased metabolic rate. It's going to be a decreased temperature. These people feel cold a lot of the time. They do have a decreased appetite, but they are increasing their storage of fat simply because they're not burning off all of that fuel, so that does result in weight gain. Decreased heart rate, and these people, exactly the opposite again as what we saw with the hyperthyroidism. Instead of being active, they are tired, apathetic a lot of the time. So some specific names for conditions for hyper and hypothyroidism. Hyperthyroidism is also an autoimmune disease, which is referred to as Graves' disease, and different versions of hypothyroidism. Cretinism is the name that we use in children, myxedema in adults. And if there is an enlargement of the thyroid gland, that is referred to as goiter, and this results from inadequate iodine. Inadequate iodine. So let's just take a look at why that might be the case if you don't have enough iodine in your diet, why that leads to an enlargement of the thyroid gland. Well, if we go back to this picture here, if there isn't enough iodine, then what's going to happen is you will not be able to produce the thyroid hormone. So decrease in iodine results in no thyroid hormone, or much less being produced by the thyroid gland. Well, if you don't have that thyroid hormone being produced, well, we said that there would be a negative feedback if it is being produced. So if we turn that around, if there's not enough thyroid hormone circulating around, then you have no negative feedback. With the lack of negative feedback, that means that the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary are going to be producing their respective hormones, and they're going to be increasing the production then of the releasing hormone by the hypothalamus and an increased production of thyroid stimulating hormone by the anterior pituitary. And this is really the key. If you do have an increased amount of thyroid stimulating hormone, that's what's going to lead to the enlargement of the thyroid gland. It's being overstimulated by the excess amount of thyroid stimulating hormone. But even though it's being overstimulated, there's still it's not a sufficient amount of iodine, so you still cannot make the thyroid hormone. So this continual stimulation increases the size of the thyroid gland. Treatment for this is to provide iodine in the diet. Now in our diets, iodine is added to table salt, so it isn't usually a problem for people in the Western world anyway. But if there are some parts of the world that don't have access to iodine in their diet, then this would be one of the complications associated with that. So all of that was for the thyroid gland. The next hormone that we're going to talk about, or rather a couple of hormones, have to do with the regulation of calcium in your body. So calcium, very important for the functioning of a number of different systems. We did already see that it is important at the synapse for the functioning of the nervous system. In Biology 20, you would have learned about the function of calcium in terms of leading to the contraction of your muscles. And you probably already know this one. Your bones are dependent upon calcium for their strength. So a lack of calcium in the diet, a lack of calcium in your body, will then lead to problems associated with the nervous system, with the muscular system, and with the skeletal system. And the most obvious one being, if the bones don't have a sufficient amount of calcium, they are weaker, they're more brittle, and they're more susceptible to breaks and fractures. So we see these prefixes again. The hypo means low, and in this case it is low calcium, and it is in the blood that we're referring to when we use these terms. The opposite is going to be hypercalcemia. This is going to be high calcium in the blood. So in both cases, it can create some problems. As mentioned, with the hypocalcemia, the major problem is going to be brittle bones susceptible to fractures. And for high blood calcium concentrations, it can lead to organ dysfunction, internal organs, and it can lead to the formation of some kidney stones as well. Most of the calcium in your body is not in the form of ions. So for muscles to function properly, for the nervous system to function properly, you do need to have calcium in the ionic form, which is Ca2+. Most of it, though, is not in this form. The calcium that is in your bones, it's in, well, what is called the mineral phase, and that is not in the form of the ion, and that is what we find in your bone. That's where most of it is stored in your body. So how do you regulate the amount of calcium in your body? Well, really three different regions of your body, three different processes involved in the regulation of calcium. It can involve the small intestine, which is where you absorb calcium that you take in through your diet. It involves the kidneys, where you can get rid of any excess calcium or hold on to what you already have. And it's going to involve the bones, where you store the major amount of calcium in your body. So linking all of these together is going to be the blood, where you transport calcium from one part of the body to another part of the body. So it's these different structures and different processes that are going to be involved with a couple of hormones that we'll talk about for blood calcium regulation. So the first one here is parathyroid hormone, and it is abbreviated PTH, parathyroid hormone. And it is produced by a gland, or actually four separate glands that sit behind the thyroid gland, not part of the thyroid gland. These are the parathyroid glands. So the parathyroid glands are going to produce their hormone, the parathyroid hormone, When the amount of calcium in the blood, again, it's the blood that we're focusing on here, when the amount of calcium in the blood is low, that is when we're going to have the production of the parathyroid hormone. So what this parathyroid hormone is going to do is it's going to increase the reabsorption of calcium by the kidneys. So the calcium is going to pass through Bowman's capsule. It'll end up in the filtrate, but if you have low blood calcium, your body does want to hold on to whatever it has. So that's going to be one of the targets of parathyroid hormone, the kidneys, telling it to reabsorb the calcium. What it's also going to lead to, working through vitamin D in your body, it's also going to increase the absorption of calcium by your intestines. So a couple of different targets here. Increased absorption, whatever food you're taking in through your diet, if there is calcium, then parathyroid is going to enhance the absorption of that calcium. And it's at the same time going to tell your kidneys to hold on to whatever calcium is present in your body and not excrete it. This also involves the bone as well, so let's take a look at this picture here. So what we're trying to regulate through homeostasis is the amount of calcium in your blood. What happens if we have a decrease in the amount of calcium in your blood is falling? We're going to stimulate the parathyroid glands. Parathyroid glands, three different target tissues, the kidneys for reabsorption, the bones, we're going to release some of the calcium from the bones and move it into the blood. And finally, the small intestines, absorption of calcium from your food. And all three of these are going to serve to increase the concentration of calcium in the blood. So hopefully those are eventually going to bring your body back into homeostasis in terms of the concentration of calcium. So this hormone here, parathyroid hormone, is the major one involved in calcium regulation, but there is one other one as well, as I have here. It is a fairly minor hormone, at least in humans, in terms of calcium regulation. Calcium metabolism and calcium regulation in your body. The calcitonin is produced by a different group of cells all in the same area of the thyroid and the parathyroid gland. But these are produced by what are called the parafollicular cells. So it is a separate cell type. It is a separate tissue that we find around the thyroid area, different from the thyroid producing cells producing the thyroxine, and different from the the parathyroid gland producing the parathyroid hormones. This one here, production is stimulated by high blood glucose. So notice that that is exactly the opposite stimulus as what we saw for the parathyroid hormone. What this hormone does is, instead of increasing the blood calcium, it is going to decrease the blood calcium. So it does exactly the opposite as what we saw for the parathyroid hormone. And that's why what we say is that for this hormone here and the parathyroid hormone, they are antagonistic. Parathyroid hormone does one thing, calcitonin does exactly the opposite. And if we take a look at this picture here, it again is showing us what's going on in the blood and what the response is for these two different hormones. If we have the amount of calcium going up in the blood, you don't need as much in your blood. It's taking your body out of homeostasis. You need to get it out of your blood. And what can take it out of your blood is that calcitonin, or take it out of your blood and move it into your bone. The other hormone, parathyroid, is if the calcium level is now too low. If it's too low, the parathyroid is now going to take it out of the bone and return it to the blood. So the action of these two hormones, and again it is primarily in humans the parathyroid hormone, is going to allow you to regulate and maintain homeostasis in terms of the blood calcium that you have. So having said that about the calcitonin, there is one major function associated with it, or one major time when it is used and does become important, and that is in typically elderly people that maybe don't have enough calcium in their diet or are not absorbing calcium as much, and as a result, not as much of that calcium is ending up in their bone. So someone that is elderly and has very weak and brittle bones, they have a condition called osteoporosis, which more or less means that there are holes in the bones, and that makes it fairly weak. So these people, they will be given typically three different things. They will be given some calcium to increase the amount of calcium that they could possibly absorb, but they may not be absorbing it. So along with this, they're also given calcitonin. And to help out with this as well, they're typically given vitamin D. So that would be to treat this condition of osteoporosis.